discussing the political history of the United States, there is an area that is often overlooked, and that is the ideological evolution that occurred, named Calhounism, and for good reason. It was structured after the principal arguments put forth by a man named John C. Calhoun, who was one of the most influential statesmen of the 19th century, at least early on. He was a very gifted orator. He was the principal fire eater, a group of fanatical pro-slavery Southern Democrats. And he was not a very good man by any real moral or ethical standards. Although at the time he was a hero among those who pushed for slavery. He was a founding member of the Democrat Party, and he shaped and molded really the governing philosophy of the party, arguably up until the Reconstruction era or even later. So Calhounism is the name attributed to this group of ideals that he expressed. And what's vital about Calhounism is it took the founding era understanding of slavery as a necessary evil meant to be restricted, and then with the slave trade effectively prohibited, it was doomed to its ultimate extinction. This was a universal acknowledgement. It was the opinion in the public square. Slavery was a transplanted evil forced on them from Britain, and was really only influential in a couple states at the time, Georgia and South Carolina primarily. However, this changed very drastically. So Calhounism itself actually altered the public and political understanding of what slavery was and changed it from a necessary evil into a divine right. Slavery became intermixed with early concepts of white supremacy, and of course that formed the ideological foundations of the Democrat Party at the time, and for about an arguably long period afterwards. So Calhounism first transformed this concept of slavery away from necessary evil that was kind of transplanted from a mother nation and that had pre-existed as a human institution for thousands of years prior. And so with the understanding that the nation was founded in a new type of a culmination of Enlightenment thought and human experimentation, it was thought that it would ultimately just kind of diminish on its own. Calhounism changed that. Not only was slavery a divine thing, but it was justified in religion, in science, and philosophy. Another one of the tenets of the founding era was that slavery was meant to be restricted, that the federal government had the authority to restrict slavery in any new territory. That was most obviously demonstrated in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, authored, of course, by Thomas Jefferson, and lamented by John C. Calhoun, who considered that ordinance to be an immoral extension of the grievous error that was the Declaration and its idea of human equality. Now, under Calhounism, slavery necessitated expansion. So slave expansionism became one of the guiding principles of the emergent Democrat Party as well, which resulted in a series of conspiracies and political subterfuge, a war with Mexico, attempts to buy Cuba, and other such things. And the intent was to expand territory that could be slave territory. And of course, this resulted in abject violence and political terrorism in the events called Bleeding Kansas that arose as a consequence of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which Bleeding Kansas will most certainly be addressed specifically later on, and especially for its kind of anti-hero champion, John Brown. So Calhounism also introduced elements of German philosophical thought. Calhoun really invented the idea of identity politics as it applied to the United States. So he took this kind of German or early French idea, if you look at the Babouvis, of the oppressor and the oppressed paradigm. And he applied that to the South. Not to the oppression of slaves, of course, but to the tyranny of northern free states and really all those opposed to slavery. Really, Calhoun he satisfies kind of the popular trope of that Southern gentleman, quick to temper, ruled by passions more so than reason. Although, unfortunately, he was successful, very successful, wielding reason to his own advantage, and for that of, the expansion of slavery and protection of slavery. So he introduced this conflict, and why this is so important is, although there had always existed a difference of opinion, let's say, on slavery, and you can the debates surrounding the Declaration highlight this very clearly. They lacked a lot of the vitriol and the animus that later came, similar to attempts to first malign the founding and Declaration to advance slavery, and then later to revise and pervert these founding ideas in defense of slavery by Stephen Douglas. Calhoun introduced this conflict where any attempt to control or restrict slavery, or really even any thought or argument against slavery, was violence. And of course, that has obvious applications at the present day. But even then, you could see how this elevated the political temperature. And this was essential because in the South, a great majority of whites did not own slaves, and a great majority of whites were uneducated and illiterate. The term white trash actually originates as a pejorative term applied to this massive group of whites. There's kind of this kind of weird understanding that the South was just populated with slave owners, and that's very much not true. Depending on the time period, the real big slave owners, 100 or more slaves, were often less than 1% of the population. By 1860, a little over 76% of all Southern whites owned 0 slaves. So it was not a ubiquitous institution in the South. So because the slave-holding kind of master class, since they were in such a minority, we'll say 25% just to be generous, that necessitated means of controlling the rest of the masses so that they could maintain power. And Calhounism helped satisfy that. He convinced the rest of the Southern whites that they were in a struggle, straight out of Marx's playbook. Although, in Calhoun's case, it was out of Engels' playbook. And keeping the population whipped up in this kind of political frenzy over this alleged invented and fabricated conflict, he was able to secure their loyalty. If you consider how many Southerners died in the Civil War to protect and expand slavery, and they owned no slaves themselves, while they had been successfully indoctrinated by the ruling elites who controlled and restricted education, to the point, actually, of burning federal postage centers to the ground, postal offices. That was actually sanctioned by Democrat Andrew Jackson and Adam Kendall, who was a Democrat operative as Postmaster General at the time. So you have this emergent ideology that is custom designed with the extent or the explicit purpose of expanding slavery, protecting slavery at the federal level, and redefining slavery away from a moral ill to a moral obligation. You had within Calhounism this larger argument that came to be referred to as the positive good, which it's generally considered to be kind of a newly emergent philosophy at the time, but it really was not. Instead, it was, well, the slave institution, the master-slave relationship, is the best way for blacks to live, this theory posits. They are civilized, they're proselytized, they're exposed to culture and everything else. They live a much better life, Calhoun and others said, as slaves, where they can never enjoy that on their own. And that's also where this argument emerged that it was actually better to be a slave in the South than to be a free laborer in the North. And there's lots of very interesting interplay that goes on here, including the influx of Fabian socialism already early in the nation, which, as one might suspect, found pretty fertile soil in the Democrat Party at the time as well, largely because slavery was treated as a solution to income inequality. Yep, that was the original application of socialism in the United States, was as a tool to justify slavery as a positive good. So you had that argument that also began to permeate kind of the social political sphere. And what that created was, well, if you were against slavery, well, you were actually in favor of a worse life for Africans. So it was an attempt to really distort reality in order to gain kind of a sense of moral superiority or moral high ground. Also emergent during this time, and largely because of Calhounism and its oppressor-oppressed paradigm, was this idea of the irrepressible conflict. And what this did is this whole idea was just kind of putting a phrase to describe kind of a national sentiment that what it had originally kind of been an amicable disagreement. 11 out of 13 colonies at the signing of the Declaration were willing to codify abolition in that document. Only 2 states refused, of course, South Carolina and Georgia, and that prevented it from being adopted into the final measures. But that was a conflict born of what they felt was Southern necessity at the time. There was no such type of good-natured sportsmanship at this period. And that was required, actually, because of the Declaration. All of a sudden, you had the first nation that ever been founded on ideas of universal human equality. And then you had a group of people who rejected that notion because they were white supremacists or European supremacists, if you're Stephen Douglas and you're running for president as a Democrat in 1860. And so you have to create a type of counter ideology or a counterculture to those ideas for the purpose of sustaining kind of this marks of the master class kind of thing, to borrow a phrase from the late great Harry Jaffa. So Calhounism really set the country on course for the Civil War by destroying any potential, really, of a political solution to the slave dilemma. Although many attempts were made in the subsequent years, multiple compromises, including disastrous effects with direct democracy in new territories. But the great thing to understand about Calhounism is that it was an utter perversion of the founding doctrine. It was created to combat the founding doctrine. So, at least in with the convenience of historical hindsight, it does serve a useful advantage in providing a foil to the Declaration, the Constitution, the founding era understanding of what slavery was and how slavery should be addressed. We went from on a course of its ultimate distinction to we should have constitutional amendments that protect it forever. And this was especially evidenced with after the Southern states, Democrat states, finally seceded. And in so doing, their first order of business was to rewrite their own founding documents. And in those documents, they did, in a literal sense, enshrine the right to property in human beings and use racially charged words to specifically create white supremacy. So their nation, the Democratic Confederate States, were legitimately founded as a nation premised on slavery and white supremacy, which is kind of a point of hilarity because that is incorrectly attributed to the real United States, which creates kind of a strange conundrum because there would be no need to branch off and create a nation founded on slavery and white supremacy if you're breaking away from a country that's founded on racism and white supremacy. So in many respects, the actions of the Democrat Party during this time really just kind of undergird and support prior notions that the founding, the Declaration, the Constitution, other things were very powerful anti-slavery documents and ideas. So Calhounism ultimately set the course for the Civil War, and it should be understood that Calhounism was the governing philosophy of the Democrat Party. This was evidenced in the Stephen Douglas debates, where Douglas, who by most conceptions at the time was a moderate Northern Democrat, he stated that when the Declaration wrote about all men being created equal, it wasn't just white men. He took it a step further and said all white European men. So I guess if you're Irish, you need not apply, which was a logical progression of that idea. So Calhounism, it changed the political landscape of the country forever. And what you'll see in later episodes is that a lot of these Calhounist ideas just began to be gently modified and never truly left the philosophy, the political philosophy of the Democrat Party, especially with its embrace of the oppressor-oppressed paradigm and also of white supremacy, and using a ignorance or a compelled ignorance and as a tool of controlling large populations of individuals, keeping them stirred up only through deeply emotive appeals to passion, and also through tight regulation of communications and information. It was Andrew Jackson and his administration that burned abolitionist pamphlets. They prohibited Uncle Tom's Cabin from being passed and distributed in the South. And Harriet Beecher Stowe's book was not the only one that found, its use as kindling, pretty much, pursuant to the policies and beliefs of Calhounism. Any word written against slavery was violence, and for decades and decades, the Southern underclass of sorts was just constantly prodded in this great oppressor-oppressed paradigm. So, by the onset of the Civil War, they were well conditioned to act as a disposable army. But Calhounism changed the political landscape, and we will see how it reflects in unfolding events in some further episodes.